He walked in ready to dominate the stage. Robert Darrow, Oscar winner, political firebrand, a man who thought no one could challenge his truth. He laughed, he taunted, and for 10 minutes he thought he was winning. Until Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez opened a worn folder. Until she read words he wrote years ago. Words he never thought the world would hear again. What followed wasn't a debate. It was a reckoning. No shouting, no insults, no theatrics. Just memory. And when she looked him in the eye and said, "You praised courage before it scared you," the entire studio froze. He didn't walk off in protest. He stormed out in silence. And millions watched it happen live. This story is fictional, but the emotions it stirs, the fear of being exposed, the weight of being remembered, and the power of speaking truth without raising your voice, those are real. Welcome to the letter she kept. You're watching Two Americas, and tonight they're sitting 10 feet apart. The camera swept across the studio like a hawk, gliding over rows of audience members dressed in sharp business suits, stars and stripes pins gleaming under cold studio lights. The backdrop flickered in high definition, a split screen of the Capitol Dome and a rusting factory in Ohio. Two Americas wasn't just the name of the show. It was a warning. A countdown clock pulsed on the corner monitor. 00:6, 00:5. Backstage, Alexandria. Ocasio-Cortez stood still as stone. She wasn't adjusting her blazer. She wasn't checking her makeup. She was breathing, deeply, intentionally. The kind of breath you take when you know you're walking into a room not made for you. When her name was called, she stepped into the light, not with swagger, but with purpose. The camera caught the flash of her white suit jacket, crisp and unflinching against the stark, stage-designed patriotism around her. Her heels echoed once, twice on the studio floor. She didn't smile. Across from her, already seated, was Robert Darrow, veteran actor, Emmy-winning performer, darling of late-night monologues. At 68, he wore his ego like a tailored coat. Darrow leaned back in his chair, one leg crossed, his lips curled in a smile that wasn't meant to welcome. It was the smile of a man who believed he already won. He had done this 100 times. Show up, throw verbal punches, walk away with viral applause. The studio crowd leaned his way. A few fans had already waved small signs during the warm-up. Team Darrow, tell it like it is. This was supposed to be another knockout. Another night he'd dominate the edit. But what he hadn't noticed, what most hadn't, was that AOC hadn't come for the camera. She had come for the contradiction. The host, Melissa Kent, sat between them, her voice smooth and controlled. Tonight, we welcome two powerful voices from opposite ends of America's political spectrum. Our goal, a civil conversation about democracy, division, and where we go next. Her tone was neutral, but her eyes darted. Even she could feel it, the quiet heat of something volatile just beneath the surface. Melissa turned to Darrow first. Robert, you've said recently that democracy is in crisis, and that voices like Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez are, quote, fueling the fire. Do you stand by that? He didn't hesitate. Absolutely, he said with a grin. It's not personal, of course, but when outrage becomes a career, democracy pays the price. A polite laugh from the audience, a few nods. The game had begun, but AOC didn't flinch. She didn't even turn to him. Instead, she looked out, past the cameras, past the lights, into the lens like it was a window. Her first words were quiet, controlled. I've read your work, Mr. Darrow. I remember when you used to write about empathy. That wasn't on her script. That wasn't expected. Melissa blinked. Darrow stiffened, just slightly. And somewhere backstage, a producer looked up from the switchboard. This wasn't going to be the debate they rehearsed, because in AOC's bag, tucked neatly between a copy of the Constitution and a creased sheet of hotel stationery, was a letter with Darrow's name on it. Dated, signed, long forgotten, but not by her. The cameras didn't catch it yet. The crowd didn't know, but something had shifted. And for those watching at home, leaning in, hand hovering over the remote, they didn't know what was coming next. But they knew one thing. They wouldn't be switching channels. Not tonight. Robert Darrow adjusted his cuffs and leaned into the mic with a practiced grin. You know, he said, tone syrupy and slow. When I was her age, I was reading Baldwin, marching in the streets. These days, you've got elected officials doing policy breakdowns on TikTok with dog ear filters. Real progress. The crowd laughed on cue, sharp, comfortable, familiar. Even Melissa, the host, offered a tight smile, though her eyes flicked briefly toward AOC, as if to gauge if she'd take the bait. AOC didn't. She simply tilted her head, like she was still deciding whether the moment deserved a response. Her hands rested calmly in her lap, her expression unchanged. She scanned the audience, not with disdain, but with clarity. A row of middle-aged viewers in polo shirts, two women up front in red, white, and blue scarves, a young black man in the third row who hadn't clapped yet. No one here expected her to win the room. That wasn't what she came for. Darrow, sensing an opportunity, pressed in. Look, she's smart, I'll give her that. Charismatic, no doubt. But if hashtags and hot takes could govern a country, we'd be living in utopia. More laughter. Another nod to the audience. He was building momentum, the kind he knew would clip well on Twitter by morning. AOC finally spoke, voice smooth and composed. You're not wrong, she said evenly. We are different generations. She paused. You grew up watching Walter Cronkite. I grew up watching school shootings unfold in real time. That silenced a few. The laughter faded, but not entirely. Darrow leaned back slightly, lips twitching into something between amusement and dismissal. Cute line, he said, but let's not pretend memes are a political strategy. AOC let the air settle before answering. I don't pretend, she said. I just remember. And the people I represent, single moms, factory workers, students drowning in debt, they don't care if the solution is delivered in a tweet or a town hall. They care that someone finally shows up. It didn't get applause, not yet, but it changed the temperature. Slightly. She let the silence hang, then glanced briefly down at the floor near her feet. Her bag sat quietly by the base of her chair, modest, neutral, unobtrusive. But inside was the folder, worn at the corners, folded once across the middle. She hadn't touched it, not yet, because the moment wasn't ripe, not yet. Darrow smiled again, sensing her restraint as hesitation. See, he said to the crowd, this is what I mean. She's measured, sure, but in politics, you can't just wait for your viral moment. You've got to lead. AOC turned to face him fully for the first time. And leadership means what exactly? Raising your voice first? Insulting before understanding? She smiled gently, almost imperceptibly. Sounds more like a script than a conviction. The crowd quieted. Darrow leaned forward, about to respond, but Melissa cut in, voice steady. Let's pivot to our first segment, democracy under pressure. Both of you have spoken about threats to democratic norms. Congresswoman, let's start with you. AOC nodded but didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked into the camera, direct, unflinching, and said, the greatest threat to democracy isn't disagreement, it's forgetting who we used to be. The camera held on her face. Darrow shifted slightly in his chair. The folder in her bag remained unopened. But it wouldn't stay that way for long. Melissa glanced at her cue cards, then at the monitor. The debate was only minutes in, but the energy had already begun to warp, flickering between performance and something heavier, less rehearsed. Congresswoman, she said carefully, some critics say you thrive on conflict, that it's become your brand. What do you say to that? AOC looked at Melissa, then past her, to the space just over her shoulder. Not at Robert, not at the crowd, somewhere beyond. Conflict? She repeated as if testing the weight of the word. Then her voice dropped half a register. Let me tell you something about conflict. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't lean in. But suddenly the room felt smaller. I remember standing in a Bronx town hall while men twice my age shouted over me for 10 straight minutes. One called me a liar in lipstick. Another asked if I even knew what the Constitution said. I'd been in Congress less than 6 months. They had their arms crossed, their voices full of certainty. Her eyes didn't waver. I stood there. I didn't interrupt. I didn't yell. I waited until they were done, And then I read the section of the Constitution they were quoting, word for word, because I'd brought a copy in my pocket, just in case. The audience stilled. Darrow stopped fidgeting. I've been laughed at on national TV, she continued. I've been told to go back to bartending. I've had men with 10 times my net worth question whether I understand economics, while ignoring that I'm one of the few up here who's ever had to choose between rent and groceries. A pause, just long enough. So no, this isn't my first studio. And conflict? I don't thrive on it. I survive it. She let that land. No dramatics, just presence. Darrow looked down at his notes. Blank cards now, suddenly small in his hands. Melissa, unsure whether to pivot or push, tried to recover. That's powerful, she offered. But what about the idea that politics today is more theater than substance? AOC turned to her with a half smile. It's not theater, she said. It's memory. And the ones who stay quiet get edited out. Then she reached, just subtly, toward the bag at her feet, brushing it with one hand. The gesture meant nothing to the audience, but backstage, one camera operator zoomed in instinctively, unsure why. That folder hadn't moved since she entered, but now it had been touched. And let me be clear, AOC added, looking directly at Darrow, I'm not here to trade sound bites. I didn't show up to win a headline. Some people come for a monologue. She folded her hands slowly. I came for the record. The studio went quiet. The segment ended not with music or applause, but with breath. And in living rooms across the country, viewers leaned forward, realizing they hadn't checked their phones in 5 whole minutes. Something real was happening, and no one wanted to look away. Robert Darrow didn't wait for the transition. As soon as the host nodded toward him, he struck with the precision of someone who'd rehearsed it 3 times in front of a mirror. Here's the thing, he began, leaning forward, his voice perfectly modulated for maximum theatrical bite. Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez speaks a lot about democracy, but from where I'm sitting, she seems to love her camera more than she loves the Constitution. The audience broke into spontaneous applause, loud, eager, approving. Someone whistled. Another shouted, "Say it again!" Darrow smiled, basking. The lights reflected off his teeth. He sat back with the confidence of a man who believed he'd just delivered the quote of the night. Melissa, the host, leaned forward slightly, instinctively trying to level the tone. Let's try to keep the discussion substantive, she said, though her voice lacked weight now. The crowd was energized and Darrow knew it. He folded his arms, waiting to see how AOC would react. Maybe a sharp comeback, maybe flustered silence. What he got instead was something entirely different. AOC didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. Her eyes remained on him for a full beat longer than expected. And then calmly, she turned to the host instead. May I ask a clarifying question? She said. Melissa hesitated, then nodded. Of course. AOC shifted slightly in her seat, just enough to be direct without posturing. When Mr. Darrow says I don't respect the Constitution, she began, I need to ask, which one does he mean? She let it breathe. The one that denied women the right to vote for 131 years? Or the one I swore to uphold when I took office? Fully aware that swearing to defend a document is not the same as pretending it's perfect? The studio went still. Darrow's smile faltered, just a notch. AOC continued, her tone even but unmistakably firm. Because I've read the Constitution, I've studied the amendments, I've carried it, page by page, into hearings where I've had to remind elected officials what the 4th and 14th even say. She turned to the audience, not with defiance, but with clarity. And I've spent years asking the question this country still struggles with. How do you honor a founding document that never intended to honor all of us? No applause this time, just listening. Melissa tried to regain balance. Congresswoman, are you saying the Constitution is flawed? AOC smiled, and it wasn't the kind that sought agreement. I'm saying it's alive, and that makes some people deeply uncomfortable, especially those who've never had to challenge it to include them. Darrow sat forward again, mouth twitching toward a smirk. You see, that's exactly what I'm talking about. It's always some deep philosophical gymnastics. Just answer the question, do you believe in the Constitution or not? AOC looked at him squarely. I believe in expanding the promise that was only partially delivered. I believe in amendments because I believe progress didn't stop in 1787. He scoffed. That's not an answer. It's a better one than your applause line, she replied. The crowd was quiet now, not hostile, just unsure. Somewhere backstage, a producer gestured to cut to commercial. Another shook their head. Not yet. AOC leaned back slightly, but her voice didn't lose strength. I didn't come here to be liked. I came here because I believe every generation has a duty to read the fine print of their inheritance and question what parts were never meant for them. Melissa looked at the camera. We'll be right back. But in the seconds before the fade out, the shot stayed fixed on AOC, composed, deliberate, and in that moment, utterly impossible to ignore. When they returned from the break, the lighting seemed colder, though nothing had changed technically. The audience, once gleeful and reactive, now sat straighter, quieter. Melissa cleared her throat and tried to reset the tone. Let's move to the next question. Economic progress. Both of you have spoken on wage issues and working class struggles. Robert, your thoughts? Darrow picked up his cue without hesitation. Sure, I've spent my life supporting fair wages. But let's be honest, what we're seeing now isn't economic reform. It's chaos dressed up as compassion. When you tax small businesses into the ground, when you hand out government checks like party favors, what you get is inflation, not dignity. There were a few nods in the crowd. He was back in his rhythm. You don't empower the poor by punishing the middle class, he added with a knowing look toward AOC. She didn't rise to it, didn't flinch, just folded her hands and waited. Then when the pause finally came, she began. Robert, I've read your speeches. You say the working class deserves respect. I agree. So let's start there. Her tone was calm, almost gentle, but it carried the kind of weight that demanded quiet. Over the last 3 years, wages for the bottom 50% of earners rose faster than they have in decades. Not because of trickle-down fantasies, because of policies that prioritized people who don't own stock portfolios. Darrow looked like he was preparing a response, but she didn't give him the opportunity, not by cutting him off, but by refusing to let the air break. Union membership is climbing again after decades of being crushed under corporate lobbying. Why? Because for the first time in a generation, workers believe they have leverage, and leaders who'll back them when they use it. Her gaze swept the room now, slow and deliberate. That's not chaos. That's what progress looks like when it doesn't ask permission. The audience didn't clap, but it shifted. A man in the third row leaned forward. A woman who had laughed earlier now watched with her arms crossed, not defiantly, but thoughtfully. And affordable health care, AOC continued, isn't a handout. It's the difference between surviving a diagnosis or being bankrupted by one. I've sat with parents who ration insulin. I've stood in hospital waiting rooms where families whisper about copays like they're poison. You call that dignity? Melissa, sensing the shift, hesitated before interjecting. Congresswoman, Robert has said that reforming healthcare requires fiscal discipline. How do you respond to concerns about long-term costs? AOC turned to her, not annoyed, but intentional. We always find money for war, for tax cuts to the wealthiest, for bailouts no one remembers 6 months later. But when it comes to keeping someone alive after a stroke, suddenly we're broke? Her tone never rose, but it cut cleaner than any shout could. Darrow opened his mouth. She waited. He closed it again. And I'm not here to demonize anyone, she added. I'm just tired of the same story being sold as the only story. Then she looked at Darrow, fully now, not with contempt, but with precision. You used to believe in disruption. You used to praise it. So what changed? The facts? Or the person delivering them? That landed, not loud, not explosive, but undeniable. The audience no longer looked entertained. They looked engaged. Something had flipped, and the man who'd come for applause now found himself surrounded by something far more dangerous. Attention. AOC sat quietly for a beat, letting the last echo of her previous words settle across the studio like settling dust. Then she leaned forward slightly, the shift so minimal it could have gone unnoticed, if the atmosphere weren't now coiled in suspense. You know, she began, voice level but tighter. Back in 2011, you were interviewed on a panel about youth activism. She didn't look at Robert Darrow yet. It was a Q&A session after the release of that documentary you produced, the one about civic engagement. The audience didn't react. Most had never seen it. But Darrow did. His jaw clenched almost imperceptibly. The camera, sharp as a scalpel, cut to his face. You said, she continued, eyes now fixed straight ahead, that the future would belong to young people of color, women especially, who are willing to speak truth to power, not for applause, but because they can't stomach silence. Another pause. You added, when I see a young Latino organizer take the mic and hold her ground in front of a hostile room, that gives me more hope than any election ever could. Now she turned, fully, not to the camera, not to the host, to him. I was that organizer. A hush fell like a curtain, a shift in the air so swift it was almost physical. Melissa looked up from her notes, caught between awe and alarm. In the third row, someone audibly gasped. Darrow didn't move. AOC's voice sharpened, not louder but with the cold clarity of glass. You respected courage before it threatened your comfort. The words struck not as a jab, but as a fact he'd hoped she wouldn't say out loud. A past he thought was forgotten. The kind you don't deny, but you pray stays buried in footage nobody archives. You once called me Hope, she added, back when I didn't have a title. When I wasn't standing between your monologues and the memory of what you used to believe. Darrow shifted, cleared his throat, tried for a smile that didn't land. I meet a lot of people, he said, soft and unconvincing. It's possible I said something vaguely supportive back then. AOC nodded slowly. It's possible, and it's possible you meant it, but it's also possible you stopped believing in that hope the minute it became inconvenient, the minute it stopped clapping and started challenging. The audience murmured now, not in disapproval, but in recognition. They weren't watching a debate anymore. They were watching something being reclaimed. A moment, a memory, a contradiction finally cornered. Melissa, to her credit, tried to salvage the format. Robert, do you want to respond? He waved a hand, small and dismissive. This is theater. She's pulling quotes from over a decade ago to make herself the hero of some imagined fight. AOC didn't blink. I didn't pull the quote to make myself the hero, she said. I pulled it to remind you that you knew better. Once. The silence that followed was not awkward. It was earned. The studio didn't breathe. The audience didn't fidget. Even the cameras, fixed and mechanical, seemed for a second to hesitate before cutting to commercial. But before the screen faded to black, AOC's voice was heard once more. This time low, steady, direct to camera. Some people rewrite history to protect themselves. I came to remind it where it started. The lights hadn't shifted, but the room already felt colder. AOC sat motionless, her posture exact, her tone unchanged. But something in the rhythm of the air had altered. Slower, heavier, as if the truth were waiting just beneath the next breath. She turned her gaze slightly toward the host. Melissa, she said calmly, may I ask the control room to cue something? Melissa blinked, clearly caught off guard. If it's brief and relevant, of course. AOC nodded once, then looked directly into the nearest camera. Control, can we roll the 2011 Gotham Forum panel? Time-stamped August 12th? You should find the clip labeled Darrow Youth Civic Engagement. It's about 45 seconds. There was a pause, just long enough for the audience to begin wondering whether she was bluffing. Then a producer's voice crackled faintly in Melissa's earpiece. We've got it. The main screen behind the guests flickered. The glossy studio backdrop was replaced with something older, grainier, analog. The video was unpolished, shot with a handheld camera. The audience saw a younger Robert Darrow seated on a panel, sleeves rolled, microphone in hand, posture relaxed in a way he rarely allowed now. The date appeared in yellow in the lower right corner. His voice filled the room, the audio slightly distorted but unmistakable. I think shaking up the system is healthy, he was saying. Complacency is a disease in politics, and disruption is often the cure. We need more voices from outside the elite class. More working class, more women, more black and brown kids, especially the ones who didn't grow up thinking they were invited to the table. A pause in the old video, then a smile. That young rep from the Bronx, she's got fire. I don't care what side you're on. Courage is courage. The clip ended. The screen went dark. Silence, not discomfort, not confusion, just stillness. The kind of stillness that comes when something long buried is suddenly unearthed in front of strangers and lights and cameras that don't blink. Robert Darrow stared straight ahead. His face was a controlled freeze, but his fingers betrayed him, tapping twice against the armrest, then stopping abruptly. AOC didn't speak. Not immediately. She didn't need to. The room had heard enough for now. Melissa cleared her throat, her voice quieter than before. Congresswoman, that clip wasn't taken out of context, AOC said gently. It wasn't altered, and it wasn't archived by me. It's still up on Gotham Forum's website, under the section titled Voices for Change. She turned to Darrow. So unless you'd like to say you were misquoted on video, by yourself, I'd like to continue. Darrow finally exhaled, a short, audible breath. That was over a decade ago, he said. Things change. Do they? AOC asked. Or do people just change what's convenient to remember? She didn't wait for him to answer. She looked out toward the audience again, and for the first time the crowd didn't seem to belong to him. The laughter had stopped. The applause lines had dried. The man who had walked into the studio, certain he would dominate the airwaves, now sat beside a version of himself he couldn't talk his way past. The system didn't get shaken, Robert, she said quietly. It got scared. And when the fire you once admired got too close to your seat at the table, you stopped applauding it. Melissa glanced at the camera, her lips parted but without a line ready. No one moved. The control room didn't cut to commercial, and Robert Darrow, icon, critic, performer, just sat there, staring at a younger version of himself and losing the argument. Wordlessly. Robert Darrow shifted in his chair, jaw tight, eyes darting to the dark screen, where his past self had just offered up words he could no longer retract. He forced a chuckle, dry and hollow. Well, he said, voice pitched for composure. That was cute. He turned slightly toward the host. A nice little stunt. Dig up an old clip. Try to make me eat my own words. I see what this is now. He gestured loosely, as if waving away the last 5 minutes. You came here for a moment, not a discussion. AOC didn't respond immediately. She let the audience sit with his deflection. The host glanced between them, sensing a slip in rhythm. She opened her mouth to redirect, but AOC finally spoke. Voice measured, eyes steady. Your past isn't the insult, Robert, she said calmly. Your present denial is. The words were quiet, but they cracked through the room like bone meeting ice. You think that clip was about embarrassing you? She continued. It wasn't. It was about reminding everyone here, yourself included, that once upon a time, you believed in something before the algorithms told you what your brand should be. Darrow leaned forward, his tone sharper now. What I believed then was based on hope. What I see now is performance dressed up as principle. You talk a good game, but you've made a career out of grievance. AOC nodded. And you've made a career out of forgetting who you once were. She didn't blink. You stood for disruption until it disrupted the comfort of people who look like you. You stood for working-class voices until one of them got a seat at the table and didn't need your permission to speak. The host tried to cut in. Let's try to bring this back to policy, but neither of them moved. The audience wasn't restless anymore. They were riveted, split, yes, but no longer reactive. There were no claps, no jeers, just the unmistakable silence of people waiting to hear what would come next. AOC turned to Darrow again. You said earlier that I love the camera more than the Constitution, but here's the truth. I've stood in ICE detention centers. I've looked into the eyes of children behind chain-link fences. I've debated bills that affect whether someone's insulin is affordable enough to stay alive through next week. Her voice didn't rise, but her tempo tightened. And you? You record your outrage in makeup chairs between segments. You rehearse your fury in green rooms while sipping cucumber water. That landed. One or two people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. You act like this is about moral decay, she went on, but you've commodified cynicism. You've made hopelessness look cool because it sells airtime. Darrow's hands were clenched now, fingertips white. You're moralizing again, he said, and all you've done is play the long game so you could trap me. AOC shook her head. No, I didn't trap you. You walked in wearing your old convictions like a forgotten jacket, and I just reminded you they still had your name stitched on the inside. The host sat back slightly, eyes darting off camera, perhaps searching for a cue from producers who no longer had control of what was unfolding. The segment had slipped its leash. What was once a clean-cut debate had cracked open into something raw, unpredictable. And Robert Darrow, once sure he held the narrative in his hand, was now grasping at the pieces of a mask that no longer fit. The air in the studio had settled into something thicker than silence. It was focus, tightly wound, collective, and hovering on the edge of something no one had expected to feel tonight. Recognition. Not agreement. Not allegiance. Just recognition. Robert Darrow shifted again in his seat, this time not in defiance but discomfort. The armor he wore, wit, bravado, reputation, suddenly didn't feel flame-proof. He glanced toward the audience, as if searching for a lifeline, a laugh, a sign that the old rules still applied. But even those who had cheered his opening barbs now sat quiet, their eyes not wide with indignation, but narrowed in thought. AOC didn't gloat. She didn't press. She let the quiet do what applause never could. The truth doesn't need a cheer track, she said softly. It echoes by itself. There were no claps, but in the second row, a man in a Navy veteran's cap gave a subtle nod. Behind him, a middle-aged woman with a tightly folded program leaned forward slightly, her arms still crossed but looser now. These weren't converts. These were Americans who had come to watch a fight and accidentally found something that felt uncomfortably like reflection. Darrow opened his mouth, then closed it again. The stage lights, once his spotlight, now felt invasive, harsh. Melissa, ever the professional, tried to reclaim the tempo. Let's pivot to our next segment on institutional trust. But AOC was already turning toward the camera, her posture unchanged, her tone steady, her presence sharper than ever. We talk a lot about memory and politics, she began. What we forget, what we pretend never happened, what gets buried beneath slogans and segment breaks. She didn't name him, she didn't need to. But America remembers more than it admits. Her eyes held the lens like a challenge, not to a man on stage, but to the audience watching at home, in living rooms lit by phones, in diners where TVs flickered above the booths, in basements where old clips go viral one frame at a time. It remembers the promises, it remembers who disappeared when things got hard, and it remembers who stood their ground, even when the room wasn't built for them. Melissa looked off stage, a producer's voice faint in her earpiece. Let it breathe. Let her finish. AOC let the pause speak louder than anything rehearsed. She didn't blink. She didn't break. Her voice remained quiet, controlled. You don't have to agree with me, but don't pretend the truth changes just because it makes you uncomfortable. For a moment, even the camera operators didn't move. No pans, no zooms. Just the uncut stillness of a room realizing it had shifted on its axis. Darrow exhaled audibly, his expression unreadable. Part irritation, part fatigue. He looked not at her, but at the floor. For the first time, he looked tired. Melissa cleared her throat again, gently. We'll take a short break. Stay with us. The feed began to fade, but in the final second before the screen dipped to black, the camera held on AOC, her hands folded, her gaze unflinching, her presence like a line in the sand. The audience didn't need a cue to stay silent, and across the country, viewers didn't reach for the remote. They leaned in. The lights came back up slowly, but the tension hadn't faded with the commercial break. If anything, it had thickened. Darrow had retreated into a practiced stillness, lips tight, eyes steady but defensive. AOC, by contrast, seemed even more composed, like someone who had finally stepped into terrain she had walked before. She didn't look at the host. She didn't wait for a cue. Robert, she said quietly but directly, you don't remember me, do you? The question landed not as a challenge but as a curiosity, genuine, almost gentle. Darrow gave a quick, scoffing exhale. We've never met, he said flatly. At least not in any meaningful way. AOC's eyes didn't waver. Tampa, March 2010. You were the keynote speaker at a veterans fundraiser. Small room, maybe 40 guests. Red brick event space behind a local VFW. It rained that night, just enough to make the parking lot smell like metal. She didn't smile, but her voice grew warmer. You showed up late, no entourage, just you and one assistant who couldn't get the projector to work. So you spoke without slides. 5 minutes unscripted. The audience was silent now, not confused, but spellbound. Darrow blinked once. His body didn't move. You talked about service, she went on, about how your father never made it home from Vietnam, and how you promised yourself you'd show up for people who served, whether or not the cameras were rolling. She turned slightly toward the crowd. And after your speech, you didn't leave. You stayed, sat down next to the guests, asked about their deployments, listened. She looked back at him. You sat 2 seats down from me. Darrow's face remained neutral, but his fingers tapped twice against the edge of the chair, a twitch he hadn't shown all night. I go to a lot of fundraisers, he muttered. You're inventing nostalgia. No, AOC replied gently. I'm recalling clarity. She shifted slightly in her seat, not for effect, but like someone turning a page in a story they already knew by heart. That night we spoke. Briefly. I told you I was interning for a local nonprofit that helped veterans appeal medical claims. You asked me why I cared. I said because someone should. Her voice didn't crack. It didn't need to. Her restraint was the tension. And you said, people like you should be running the country, not the ones pretending to care on cable news. She let the words hang. I never forgot that. Darrow finally moved, just a subtle shake of the head as if brushing away dust he didn't expect to see again. If I said anything like that, he offered dismissively, I was being polite. AOC nodded once. I believe you were being sincere. The host opened her mouth, then paused. Nothing to add. The moment didn't belong to her. AOC leaned forward, not to attack, but to return. You don't have to remember me, but I remember you. Not the version sitting here tonight. The version from that room. The one who didn't need a script to speak with soul. Darrow looked away. The audience remained completely still, and somewhere across the country, people watching, many who had never sat in a fundraiser, never met either person on that stage, began to feel a weight they hadn't expected from a political debate. Memory. AOC sat perfectly still for a moment longer, her fingers lightly brushing the zipper of the bag at her feet. The audience watched her like a room watching a fuse inch toward a flame. No one certain when it would ignite, only that it would. Then in one quiet, deliberate motion, she reached down and drew out a thin, folded piece of paper. No theatrics, no dramatic rustle, just paper worn soft at the creases, the kind of wear that only comes from being opened again and again over the years. The camera didn't zoom. It didn't have to. The silence in the studio pulled every eye toward that letter like gravity. I've kept this for nearly 15 years, AOC said, her voice level, calm, almost intimate. Not because of who you are, Robert, but because of what it meant to hear it then, from someone I respected. She unfolded the paper with the ease of familiarity. This wasn't for show. This was memory-made material. It's dated March 17th, 2010, she began. Pamela, she stopped, then corrected herself with a faint smile. Sorry, that was the one before. This one, she flipped to a second page, more worn than the first. Alexandria, she read aloud. Thank you for the conversation tonight. I appreciated your perspective. Strong but respectful. We may not agree on everything, but I admire your clarity and conviction. We need more voices like yours, even if they don't always vote like me. She looked up. Keep going, Robert. The studio gasped. Not in unison, but in waves, like sound catching up to disbelief. A half-dozen mouths hung open. One camera operator whispered, "Oh my God," and forgot to mute his mic. Melissa leaned forward instinctively, her lips parted as if about to say something, but no words came. Her earpiece crackled. Do we cut? What do we do? But no one moved. Not the host, not the crew, not Robert Darrow. He stared at the letter as if it were a ghost. You wrote that, AOC said, folding the paper gently along its original lines. You handed it to me after that night in Tampa. You said you didn't want to say it in front of everyone, that sometimes sincerity works better on paper. Darrow's lips pressed together, bloodless. His voice didn't come. I kept it because at the time, it meant something. Not because you were famous, but because I thought, for one brief moment, you saw me. Not as a threat, not as a headline, but as a citizen. She tucked the letter back into her bag, not rushed, not triumphant, just finished. Melissa glanced off stage again, her voice barely audible. Are we still live? The producer didn't answer. You don't have to apologize for changing, Robert, AOC said softly, eyes still on him. But you should at least be honest about it. Still, he said nothing. The weight of her words, her memory, her letter, all of it pressed in from angles no talking point could defend against. And as the cameras rolled, the audience no longer looked at a debate. They were watching a reckoning. AOC folded the letter once more, crease aligning neatly into the line it had followed for over a decade. Her movements were slow, deliberate, not theatrical, just careful, as if she were handling something alive. She returned it to her folder and slid the folder back into her bag. The moment didn't feel like punctuation. It felt like placement, something finding its way back to where it belonged. She looked up at Darrow. Her gaze wasn't sharp now. It wasn't angry. It was something far more difficult to deflect. Recognition. This isn't revenge, she said quietly. This is recall. The words didn't ask for a reaction. They didn't demand agreement. They just were. Darrow sat rigid in his chair, not blinking, his body still except for one hand resting on the armrest. Fingers splayed like someone bracing themselves for an impact that had already passed. Melissa's voice didn't come. No producer spoke. No one reached for a teleprompter or tried to lighten the tone. For once, the studio was exactly what it was meant to be. A room filled with light and nothing left to hide behind. I didn't bring that letter to hurt you, AOC continued. I brought it because the gap between who we are and who we pretend to be is the space where people lose faith in the truth. And tonight, I'm not asking you to believe in me. I'm asking you to remember you. She leaned back slightly, not in retreat, but in rest. The work had been done. We talk about honesty like it's a speech, but sometimes it's just letting the silence speak for itself. And so she did. The seconds that followed weren't awkward. They weren't filled with tension. They were filled with air, the kind that only enters a room after something heavy has been set down. The audience didn't fidget. They didn't murmur. They just sat with her, not because she asked them to, but because there was nowhere else to be. Darrow shifted for the first time in what felt like minutes. He reached for his water, then set it back down untouched. His voice when it came was low, almost inaudible. You don't know what this industry does to people. AOC didn't flinch. Maybe not your industry, but I know what the system does to people like me, and I know what it does to people who start with good intentions and lose themselves in applause. Melissa finally found her voice, but even she spoke with a softened edge. We still have time for one final segment, if you're both. AOC turned to her gently. I'm ready. Darrow didn't answer. She looked back at the crowd, no longer performing. She didn't lean into a camera. She didn't plant a quote. She simply said, you changed. The letter didn't. And with that, she folded her hands and let the silence return. Not as absence, but as presence. Not as a void to be filled with sound bites, but as the proof that something true had been said and didn't need to be repeated. The segment ended not with music, not with applause, not with a headline. It ended with memory, in a room full of people who suddenly realized they'd seen something they couldn't unsee. The silence lingered for half a beat too long, and when it finally broke, it shattered. Robert Darrow slammed his hand down on the armrest, not loud enough to seem violent, but enough to jolt the moment off its axis. You think you're different? He barked, voice no longer controlled. You sit there with your calm face and your soft words and pretend you're not part of the same machine? Please. The crowd flinched slightly, not recoiling but aware now that something had cracked. He leaned forward, pointing, not with his finger, but with his voice, sharp and narrowing. You've built a brand on outrage, just like the rest of us. You stand in front of cameras, you sell books, you speak on panels and talk about the working class like you didn't turn your own story into a tagline. AOC didn't move. She didn't interrupt. She let him keep going. You're just as deep in it as everyone else. Maybe deeper, he spat. Because at least I admit what this is. You still pretend there's some moral high ground, that politics is about truth and not airtime. Melissa opened her mouth, then closed it again. Her eyes darted to the producers behind the camera, who gave no cues. The control room was frozen. No one wanted to interrupt what was unfolding. Not anymore. Darrow's voice tightened. And don't you dare use that letter against me like it means something now. I was being decent, and that was before I knew what this would become. Before I knew who you'd become. He stopped, breathing heavy, chest rising and falling. The heat of his frustration saturated the room. But AOC didn't react. She waited until his words had fully settled, like a judge waiting for the noise to end before delivering a ruling. Then she spoke, quiet, even, clear. And yet, she said, I still listen. Her voice wasn't soft, it was precise, the kind of tone that doesn't rise because it doesn't have to. Even now, she added, I'm listening. The contrast hit like a wave. Rage versus control, volume versus clarity, reaction versus restraint. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't know if they were supposed to, but they leaned in again, not to watch a clash, but to witness a difference. AOC turned toward him, not to attack, but to address. I don't think I'm better than this. I think I'm trying. I think we're all trying in ways that get tangled up in power and perception and pressure. But if you think I'm in this for branding, Robert, you haven't been paying attention. She paused just enough to hold the space. I've sat with women who lost their sons to gun violence. I've walked with janitors on strike outside buildings they've cleaned for 20 years. I've stood next to single moms trying to figure out if they can afford a second child because their district has no childcare support. None of them care about my lighting or how many views I get. They just want someone to look them in the eye and not lie. Darrow didn't speak. His anger was spent, but his posture was still clenched. And if you really believe we're the same, she added, then maybe that's not my indictment. Maybe it's your reflection. The lights above seemed to glow a touch colder now. Melissa blinked, visibly unsure whether to continue. But no one moved. No one made a sound. Because in that moment, the room understood. This wasn't about who shouted louder. It was about who still knew how to listen. AOC didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. The stillness in the studio told her she finally had what she needed. Not agreement, but attention. And attention was enough to do something heavier than win. It was enough to make people feel. You say I've turned my story into a tagline, she said, turning slightly in her chair. Not toward Darrow, but toward the audience. Toward the millions watching at home. So let me tell you someone else's. She didn't pause for effect. She just continued, with the ease of someone who'd carried these names in her pocket for too long. Carmen Rivera, Queens. Her son Luis worked 3 jobs to pay rent after his dad passed from COVID. One of those jobs didn't offer health insurance. The other 2 barely paid minimum wage. He couldn't afford an inhaler refill when he caught pneumonia. He died in a hallway because the ER wait was too long and he didn't qualify for urgent care access. A few gasps escaped. No music, no montage, just words. AOC's voice didn't crack, but it trembled ever so slightly. I attended his funeral. She asked me, why does my son need a GoFundMe to breathe? I didn't have an answer. Still don't. She turned her head just slightly toward Darrow, then back to the room. And then there's Eli Friedman, 7 years old, lives in the Bronx, born with cerebral palsy. His mother, Dina, had her SNAP benefits cut after a new algorithm flagged her household as non-compliant. The only thing she did wrong was take a part-time job that paid 22 cents over the income threshold. Her hand rested still on the table, not clenched, not moving. She had to choose between bus fare to take Eli to physical therapy or buying a week's worth of diapers. And Robert, your production company put out a segment mocking benefit fraud as the new American hustle. Dina watched it while folding laundry at midnight. She told me she cried through the commercial break. The crowd didn't breathe. A woman in the front row had her hand over her mouth. Someone else blinked hard, fast, as if trying not to show it. Even the studio lights seemed dimmer now, as if the brightness had surrendered to the weight in the room. I don't speak about pain because it earns clicks, AOC continued. I speak about it because I have to sit with it, weekly, daily, sometimes hourly. Her eyes scanned the crowd, not seeking affirmation, but offering witness. You don't see these names in campaign ads. You don't hear them at black tie fundraisers, but I carry them. Not because I'm a saint, because I'm accountable. Then more softly, policy isn't abstract to me. It's Carmen, it's Eli, it's Dina, and no amount of satire or spin will ever make me laugh at their stories. She didn't cry, but she didn't need to. The emotion wasn't in her face. It was in her discipline, in how she spoke as if each name deserved its own breath. Darrow hadn't moved. Melissa swallowed hard, voice uncertain. Would you like to respond, Robert? But he said nothing, because for the first time all night, the audience wasn't watching him. They were picturing Carmen and Eli in a funeral AOC never posted on social media, but never stopped remembering. AOC let the names linger in the room a moment longer. Carmen, Eli, Dina. Not as symbols, not as proof, but as people. The kind whose lives don't get headlines, whose grief isn't trending, but who keep waking up anyway. She inhaled once, slowly, then spoke. You asked earlier if I was part of the same machine, she said, turning slightly back toward Darrow. And maybe I am. Maybe any system you enter, no matter how much you fight it, leaves a mark. But I didn't come into this for a platform. I came because one day I realized no one was coming for us, and someone had to walk in anyway. She looked to the audience, not for agreement, but for grounding. I didn't grow up dreaming of Capitol Hill. I dreamed of getting weekends off, of paying the light bill without panic, of maybe one day helping my mom retire before her knees gave out. A few heads nodded. Not out of politics, out of memory. I was a waitress, then an organizer, then someone who couldn't sit still while families were being ripped apart, and my community was treated like a statistic. I didn't yell to be heard. I testified because I couldn't unsee what I'd seen. She leaned forward now, just slightly, not as a rhetorical move, but like someone trying to level the distance between herself and the room. You want to know why I became a lawmaker? Because I got tired of watching pain be treated like background noise. Because I stood in hearings and watched lobbyists outnumber citizens 5-1. Because I watched grown men joke about budget lines that meant food or no food for a child. Her voice didn't tremble, but it didn't hide. This job isn't performance, it's presence, and presence leaves marks. That line didn't ripple, it settled. Darrow shifted again, but didn't speak. Even his frustration had grown quiet. Melissa didn't interrupt. The crew didn't glance at the clock. The audience didn't move. Not because they were afraid, because they were with her, not clapping, not performing, just breathing, together. People ask why I speak the way I do, AOC said, softer now. It's not because I like microphones. It's because I've sat across from too many mothers who thought no one was listening. I've been in rooms where silence was used like a weapon, and I've seen what happens when no one answers back. She looked at Darrow, not with judgment, with clarity. So no, I don't yell, she paused, then added, slowly, distinctly, and without apology. I testify. The room exhaled, a long, collective breath like tension breaking, not with applause, but with understanding. She leaned back again, hands folded. The lights didn't flash. The cameras didn't pan. The moment didn't call for it. Because what AOC had delivered wasn't a takedown. It wasn't a speech. It was the reason she was still in the room. And why, at that exact second, no one else wanted to leave it. The silence that followed AOC's last line had weight. Not the kind of silence that begged to be broken, but the kind that asked to be respected. The host didn't speak. The producers didn't cue a cut. Even the studio lights seemed to dim a little, as if surrendering to the gravity in the air. But Darrow, Robert Darrow, the man who had once headlined theaters and commanded Senate fundraisers with the same baritone, wasn't done. He leaned forward, his voice sharp, hoping to reclaim lost terrain. You've turned politics into a brand, he said, enunciating each word with the edge of a dagger. You don't represent people. You represent marketing metrics. The sentence cut through the room like a spark looking for oxygen. For a second, it worked. Some audience members stiffened. The host glanced toward the control booth, unsure if it was time to intervene. Darrow's tone had shifted from bitter to surgical, and he knew it. But AOC didn't flinch. She didn't lean back. She didn't blink fast. She didn't scramble for a soundbite. She just looked at him and said evenly, "And you're a memory pretending to be a future." The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. They landed. Darrow froze, not theatrically, but in that small, unmistakable way when a man realizes he's just been reduced, not by insult, but by truth. A truth too precise to dodge, too human to spin. The host's lips parted, but no words came. The control room didn't cut to commercial. The audience didn't laugh. Even those who had come in as Darrow's silent supporters sat motionless, like a church caught between sermon and confession. AOC continued gently this time, as if the fight had passed and what remained was reckoning. "You had your moment, Robert, and for a while you moved people. I know. I was one of them. You were brave once, unfiltered, raw. You made us believe politics didn't have to be poison." She didn't raise her voice. She lowered it. Not out of fatigue, but out of mourning. But then the world changed, and instead of rising with it, you reached backwards. You clung to applause you earned a decade ago and started confusing nostalgia with truth. Darrow's jaw tightened. He stared, but didn't speak. There was nowhere for the energy to go. AOC finished simply, "You called me a brand, but branding fades. Memory fades. Only presence remains." She turned to the host now, calm and composed. "Some of us are here to be useful, not liked. And if that means being misunderstood by people who once cheered for me, so be it." Melissa, the host, still speechless, nodded once. And for the first time all night, Darrow looked small, not weak, not villainous, just human, caught somewhere between regret and pride, but unable to grasp either fully. No one applauded. No music played. But the silence was not empty. It was full. Full of what wasn't said. Full of what had been revealed. And full of the unshakable sense that something, no one could quite name what, had just shifted. The moment the cameras went to wide shot, Darrow leaned in, jaw clenched, eyes locked on AOC. His voice, lower now, dripped with accusation. "You planned this. Every second of it. The clips, the quotes, the letter. It was all set up. This wasn't a debate. It was an ambush." Alexandria didn't flinch. She didn't smile. She simply tilted her head and spoke clearly enough for the back row in the broadcast. "I planned to show up with the truth. You brought the contradictions." The audience murmured. Not a laugh, not a cheer, just a collective shift, like something had tilted and couldn't go back. Darrow's hands moved fast. He ripped the mic from his lapel, the wire catching in his collar. He tossed it onto the table, and it bounced with a sharp clack. Melissa, the host, blinked hard as Darrow stood, his chair scraping loudly. "I don't do scripted outrage," he barked. "I don't do theater for likes." Alexandria stayed seated. She looked up only once. "Number, you do theater for memory, and you forgot who your audience became." Darrow froze, not for long, just enough to be noticed, then stormed off stage, past the camera, past the stunned crew, past a control room scrambling to decide whether to cut to commercial. The lights over Alexandria dimmed slightly, as if the stage knew who was no longer needed. Melissa opened her mouth to speak, then thought better of it. AOC adjusted her folder, one slow breath. Then she turned, gently, toward the empty chair Darrow had left behind. "People ask if I do this for show," she said, her voice steady, not raised. "But if I wanted a show, I would have brought a script too. I brought receipts." Silence again, not awkward, intentional. Behind the scenes, someone whispered, "He's gone." Another, "We're still live." Alexandria didn't look at the camera. She looked past it. "I didn't come to win a debate. I came to finish a conversation he started 12 years ago, and then tried to erase." The feed held, cameras catching only her. No music, no outro, just presence. It was the first time in the show's history that the segment ended with no summary, no applause, and no promise to be right back. Only an empty chair, only her voice, only the truth still seated, and that was enough. The camera cut back early. A glitch, or maybe fate. The commercial hadn't finished rolling when the feed flickered back to the live studio, revealing Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez exactly as she was, alone under the unforgiving studio lights, seated still, composed, untouched by the chaos that had just erupted. She wasn't posing. She wasn't speaking. She was simply breathing, shoulders steady, fingers resting atop the now legendary folder. The control room panicked. Producers scrambled, but the feed held. Melissa, the host, reappeared in frame, visibly rattled. Her smile was a second too late and a shade too forced. We're back. Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez remains with us after Mr. Darrow's early exit. AOC looked up, not at Melissa, not at the crew, but directly into the camera, into every living room, office screen and phone. Her voice was low but unshakably firm. "He walked off," she said, letting the words settle. "I stayed." A beat, a pause so deliberate it felt like a full stop. The truth tends to do that. Melissa didn't reply. The audience didn't move. No cue card could recover the moment. A director's voice whispered from the earpiece, "Let it breathe." And it did. AOC shifted slightly and gently laid the folder on the desk. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. Her voice was softer now, like someone reading a passage that had been memorized by heart. "Some people come to perform. I came to record, because when history shows up, it doesn't need an entrance. It just waits for someone to stay, for someone not to flinch." Her eyes didn't waver. The cameras captured it all. The tension, the grace, the unbearable stillness of someone who refused to perform rage or retreat into silence. Someone who, by merely remaining seated, had said more than 1,000 shouting matches could. Then it happened. The screen blinked. Just a flicker, then a sharp audio dip, and black. The live stream died. In homes across America, viewers hit refresh, checked Wi-Fi, switched channels. The control room scrambled to restore the signal. Engineers whispered about overloads and signal surges. 30 seconds later, the screen returned, but the moment was already gone. Yet something strange began. Cell phone clips surfaced. Behind-the-scenes audio leaked. A whispered quote from a boom mic operator went viral. "I've never seen a room silenced by stillness." Hashtags ignited. Hashtag she stayed. Hashtag Mick still hot. Hashtag letter on the table. Cable networks reran the segment on loop, but it wasn't the debate that trended. It was the silence. It was her stillness. It was the absence of performance. Darrow's name trended for 20 minutes. AOC's stayed for days. And the folder? Still closed, still sealed. She never opened it on air. Because sometimes the most powerful evidence isn't what you show. It's the fact you didn't need to. The morning after wasn't quiet, it roared. Newsrooms scrambled. Some framed it as a meltdown, others a masterclass. Headlines split down ideological lines. Darrow ambushed on air versus Ocasio-Cortez outlasts the noise. Cable hosts replayed the mic drop moment. Radio callers quoted her final words. Pundits speculated if it was all scripted, staged, but no one could ignore it. Twitter didn't just react, it ignited. Within hours, hashtag she stayed topped the trends, followed by hashtag letter on the table and hashtag Darrow walked. Conservative influencers rolled out hot takes. Liberal commentators wrote think pieces before lunch. But in the blur of analysis and outrage, one clip kept resurfacing. The camera catching AOC alone, under the lights, saying nothing, just sitting, unmoved. In the Bronx, a middle school teacher paused her lesson and played the segment for her civics class. In Atlanta, a retired nurse posted, "For once, the camera didn't blink. It just told the truth." Back in D.C., Alexandria closed her apartment door behind her. No entourage, just the faint echo of 14 hours of headlines bouncing off her phone. She didn't reach for the remote. She didn't check social media. She went to her desk. Quietly, she opened the drawer. The letter still rested there, folded neatly, its edges worn now from travel, time, memory. She stared at it, not with anger, not even regret, but with something softer. That letter wasn't a prop. It had never been. It was a moment preserved. A man who once believed in her when no cameras were watching. A signature penned before fear took the wheel. She didn't reread it. She folded it once more, gently, slowly, like closing a chapter with deliberate grace. Outside, news trucks lined up. Microphones hovered. But inside, it was still. She placed the letter beneath a book of constitutional law. Not to hide it, but to ground it. One truth pressed beneath another. Then she opened her window. Fresh air, not applause, just morning. She didn't say anything to the crowd waiting below. She didn't need to, because the real story wasn't what had been shouted, it was what had stayed. They left the studio slowly, not with the electric buzz of a typical debate taping, but with something more unsettled, quiet, searching. Some looked at each other. Others walked in silence to elevators and car services, heads tilted as if replaying moments they couldn't shake. The debate had ended, but something else had just begun. The next day, reporters interviewed half a dozen attendees from that live audience. Most refused last names, but they spoke more openly than expected. "I came to see her fold," one woman said, "but she didn't. I don't even agree with her on half the stuff she says, but damn it, she didn't dodge. Not once." A retired Marine, cap tugged low, offered quietly, "She didn't make me mad. She made me think. And that's rarer than I want to admit." In another clip, a college-age man who'd previously posted a selfie from the audience captioned, "Gonna be a bloodbath lol," went live the next morning. "I don't know what happened last night," he told his followers. "I went in for the show, but I walked out with questions I didn't have before. Not about her, about me." Clips circulated of Darrow storming out, spliced with AOC's composed stare. But it was what hadn't been scripted that people recalled. The letter, the silence, the weight of something unsaid and yet undeniable. An older black woman in the third row said, "She reminded me of Barbara Jordan." She didn't speak to dominate. She spoke to land. And it landed. Audience analysis poured in from outlets across the political spectrum. Polls shifted subtly. Nothing seismic, but notable. Among undecided voters who watched the debate, favorability for AOC rose 19%. Even more surprising, trust metrics climbed most among over 50 conservative males. But beyond metrics, something stranger emerged. A long thread on Reddit titled, "She Didn't Perform. She Stayed." It went viral not for snark or partisanship, but for the way it documented what viewers remembered. Not quotes, not stats, but feelings. Someone posted a sketch of her at the table, hands folded, eyes steady. Another shared a poem. A third simply wrote, "That moment made me uncomfortable, because I wasn't used to seeing stillness win." By the end of the week, the moment wasn't being called a takedown. It was being called a mirror. What stuck with people wasn't how loud she spoke. It was how long her silence stayed with them. The hallway outside the studio buzzed with the remnants of camera crews, whispered debates, and frantic producers on headsets. But in the center of it all, AOC walked calmly, her folder still in hand. No entourage, no makeup retouch. Just the quiet weight of a moment that refused to shrink. A reporter, breathless, caught up with her before the exit. "Congresswoman, after everything, what was your goal tonight?" AOC didn't pause. She turned slightly, her voice gentle but firm. "Not to win, just to remind." "Remind of what?" he pressed. She glanced back at the studio door, now closed behind her. "That memory doesn't belong to headlines. It belongs to people. And sometimes, people forget what courage looked like before it got edited." She gave no soundbite, no dramatic flourish. Just a nod, and then walked on. Cut to the studio, now empty. A single chair still turned toward the camera. The table still held the folder. A production assistant entered quietly, hesitated, then left it untouched. Voiceover begins as the image slowly fades. Truth doesn't always storm in. Sometimes it waits, patiently, for the room to notice. And when it does, when it finally stands without applause or permission, what's left isn't a debate. It's a mirror. Black screen. Text appears, steady and silent. The letter she kept. What made this story so powerful wasn't the confrontation, it was the quiet after. In a world where volume often passes for conviction, AOC's restraint was her sharpest blade. She didn't need to dominate the room. She needed to hold it accountable. Her power wasn't in the comeback lines, but in the uncomfortable truths she let breathe. Darrow's meltdown wasn't her victory, it was his revelation. This story reminds us that strength doesn't always look like shouting. Sometimes it's being willing to stay seated when others walk away. Sometimes it's carrying a letter for years, not out of spite, but out of memory. AOC didn't aim to destroy. She came to reflect, and in doing so, she reminded us that truth, when spoken without fear, doesn't need applause to echo. Now we ask you, have you ever witnessed a moment where calm truth spoke louder than any argument? What did it reveal, not just about others, but about you? If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Alexandria Rising Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Alexandria Rising Stories.